Hi, good evening and welcome to an open session of my science opinion writing class. You're very welcome to join us, and we thank our speakers for coming tonight. And welcome to the students from the opinion writing class who are here. I particularly want to give a shout out to several alumni of the classes who've come down. And it's so gratifying to me, the professor, that you come back to Columbia and that you come back to our classes, and that it means something to you, because it means a lot to us. It's joyous and gratifying to see you all, especially in these difficult times. But before we begin, I'd like to also thank Maria Gray and Marika Ragaskolkaya. Did I say that right, Marika? And Anna Matson for their help in putting this together. I know it sort of looks seamless, but it's really a lot of work, and they do people's jobs at it. So what we're going to do tonight is meet editors, science editors at that, and learn about what they do and how they do it. And we'll do that for about 40 minutes. Then we'll throw the floor open to all of you. In the front row are students from the current class and a few alumni from previous classes. And we'll ask you to, after 40 minutes of go-rounds of questioning among us, we'll throw the floor open to you with some ground rules. We ask that you ask one singular question, that you not speechify, and that it actually be a question. That's a basic rule of interviewing. You only ask one question within a question. We're going to be strict about that. I know there's a tendency for people to want to make statements and speechify, but that's not what we're doing here. So basically tonight we're going to ask two questions of our panelists. And the first is, how did they develop their careers? And the second is, how does a journalist function in the current political atmosphere? And how do we get the science message out? You know, I used to be a political journalist. And then, thanks to Corey Dean, I became a science journalist. And I always thought that science journalism was a refuge from all the dirt and nag and difficulties of the political world. Well, here we are. It's no refuge at all. And we've got to talk about strategies to get already a difficult subject out to the public. And we have an extraordinary panel of practitioners who are really good at what they do to talk about it. So now let's meet our panelists. I think we just introduced people and asked one question at a time. Eric Roston. He's a prize-winning reporter on his own right, but he's also the sustainability editor of Bloomberg News. And his website says that he spent the last 15 years covering climate change. Quote, in all its incarnations, from science to technology, finance, business, and government. So Eric, tell us, how did climate change become your gig?
By accident, mostly. I wrote that bit about 15 years ago, 10 years ago. So just so I guess I have to change my website. It's funny. So I was hired by Time Magazine in the business section and wanted to get stories in the magazine. And so I basically looked at what everybody was doing, looked at what the competitors were doing, and realized that energy is really, really important. So we should write stories on it, but it was also really, really boring, so nobody else would want to write stories about it. And that was pretty much true until within the last 10 years when it became a popular topic. And then that obviously just kind of segued into climate stuff. And then within a couple of years, it just turned out climate is the most interesting thing in the world.
Vernon Lowe is the executive editor of Inside Climate News. And if you haven't seen it, you should. It's a website that deals with this topic in all its fullness. And before he became the executive editor of Inside Climate News, he was managing editor of the Houston Chronicle, the Metro editor of the Washington Post, and the California investigations editor at the Los Angeles Times at a particular moment when the LA Times was at the height of its powers and glory. So, Vernon, you've worked at so many venerable newspapers. Was it difficult to get science stories into print, let alone climate stories?
Well, when I worked for newspapers, I wasn't a science writer, and I'm still not a science writer. I was mainly a national security reporter. I covered the military and the CIA and politics and things like that. Back when I worked for newspapers, science desks were small. Even big papers like the LA Times and the Washington Post had at most one or two environment reporters. There was no such thing back then as a climate reporter. Right now I run a nonprofit that has 25 full-time climate writers. So yeah, my world has changed a lot. I agree that climate change is not only the most important story on the planet, literally, it's the most interesting because it touches everything. You can write about politics, economics, science, and to me, one of the things I like most about it is that it's grounded in science. It's not, sort of up for debate. Yeah, Trump can put out a report like the Energy Department did last week that was full of lots of fake science, but science is, there's a big, robust community there that will defend science, and so it feels like we do still have a foundation in covering climate called science that's really sort of not up for debate. And that's one of my favorite things about covering or managing coverage of climate change. And I'm not a science writer, but my favorite question is, when I'm talking to somebody who knows a lot more about science than I do, is explain it to me like I'm a 6-year-old. It's one of the great questions to ask.
Well, I think the great science writers write about science as if it's any other topic. And that's kind of what we aim to do in our classes. So, Nora Belbidia. Yes, thank you.
I know it's a tough one.
She's a senior editor in Undark, which is published at MIT, and it's an award-winning publication. Again, if you don't see it, you should subscribe. Subscriptions are free, but even if it weren't free, it would be worth seeing. And what they do is explore the intersection, as they say, of science and society. Nora has published, in addition to at Undark, at Al Jazeera, at the Columbia Journalism Review here, and but the really interesting thing about her is that prior to entering journalism, she worked on psychedelic research at Johns Hopkins, and as you know, that happens to be a really coming field right now. So Nora, you've done science journalism. What's the difference between being in a lab and being in a newsroom?
I think speed. A research lab is pretty slow, and studies take years to, from inception to completion. So Undark is a small organization. I mean, I think we take a slower approach to news, which I think is an advantage. But yeah, it's still lights and, it's way, way faster.
Do you think it's a viable route for a lot of people, perhaps people who've lost their grants and have been rendered unemployed by recent activities, that it's a viable pathway for working scientists to go?
To pivot into journalism?
Yeah.
you know.
Why?
I know, this field has its difficulties, as everyone is well aware of, but I think there's always important science stories to be told. Yeah, I think that's a tough question to answer. Depends on the person.
Sure, it always depends on the person. Jane Bornemeyer, Jane Blackburn Bornemeyer edits 200 different special sections of the New York Times, many of which involve science coverage and climate. When a writer comes to you with an idea, and it's a science idea, what makes it appealing to you? Why would it work for one of your sections?
Well, I'll tell you, is this working? Okay. So we do, as you said, like 200 sections roughly a year on a huge array of subjects. And science is only one, and it's climate, which is not surprising, on the last few years in particular. We've done, what I really like, we've done a number of sections called climate solutions. And, I think that it's helpful if there's, it's all like so frightening and so kind of depressing, right, and worrisome. What's the hope out there? What are people doing that's got some promise? Or what should we be doing as individuals that would help, even if it's a tiny thing, like, don't buy so much stuff with plastic, I mean, I think that it gives some hope and some feeling of that you can make a contribution in some way, because otherwise I think it's just it's a bummer, So that's one of those sections, and those sections have done very well. These sections always have some kind of advertising in them, which is, we don't have anything to do with the advertising that's being sold for them, but they're very popular because I think they offer some hope.
So that's good news, because one of the things we always heard, and maybe at some point Corey can talk to us about this, is that science is not thought of as a very popular scientific topic. That in a large organization, sometimes you have to really fight to get a science topic to the front of the line. But you're saying people are interested.
Oh, totally! They're totally interested. I mean, I think people are, in some ways, have sort of become, obsessed with this, and rightfully so. And actually, it's kind of interesting to me too, as we did these sections that. I mean, you have to be careful because you don't want to promise too much. You don't want to suggest that this idea that somebody has is like the answer to the climate disaster in the world. But so it takes a lot of careful reporting and careful writing to make sure we're not going too far. But I did learn that our science desk in recent year or so is also inclined a bit more towards trying to find some. Write about solutions, so it's just not all about, the downside.
Andrea Thompson works at Scientific American and does not have a problem with getting science stories to the top. So let me ask you the same question that I asked Jane. What do you look for in a climate or an environmental pitch? What rises to the top for you?
Yeah, and I'm sure it's different for Scientific American than it would be for other outlets, especially, a more general audience outlet. But we are, solutions is something we see resonating with our audience because we've talked a lot about the science for a long time, and the fact that science, that climate change is happening, hasn't changed that much. It's still the same as it was. So talking about what's changing with solutions, what can we offer people on that? We find that really resonates with readers. And also making it clear how climate change is no longer a story that's in the distant future, but something we're feeling day to day now, and in everybody's daily lives, and trying to sort of, make that clear that you right now in your life are being affected by climate change every day. And trying to offer new perspectives and ways of thinking about it that maybe people haven't sort of had before, that will make them, I never thought about it that way before.
Renee. Renee, I met about 20 years ago, and she was an editor at the time at Audubon magazine, and she brought her infant son to one of my first science writing classes. And he's, how tall now?
Yeah, he's like six plus.
Amazing, amazing. So in between all of that, she's had the most remarkable career. In addition to being an editor at Audubon, she was a correspondent for National Geographic, traveled all over the world, and every now and then, if you catch up with Renee, she was going off to Japan to do a piece on those wonderful monkeys who live in the north of Japan, or doing a piece on elephants somewhere and on elephant intelligence. And now you are doing a startup. Tell us about the startup.
Yeah, so for about the last decade or so, I was working mostly as an independent journalist after leaving my job as a features editor. And my main client was National Geographic. And as Claudia said, I was covering mostly illegal wildlife trade. And so I covered stories on like 5 continents, and I think there was 15 investigations in total during that period of time. And then about 2 years ago, National Geographic decided to cut that program. And 2 of my colleagues, editors there, they were laid off, and we all decided that the stories we'd been doing, stories like the ivory trade and bushmeat and sort of like classic big investigative stories that take a lot of time and a lot of money to do, we didn't want to see them halt. So the 3 of us got together and decided we would learn how to fundraise, and it's been a crazy ride. Just it's like getting an education in a new field. But it's been exciting and sort of uplifting during this difficult period of time in journalism, because I've come to believe that nonprofit news is probably the future. There's more jobs growing there. There's incredible opportunities and so many talented people coming together and making new things, and just not giving up.
So Catherine Bagley also is GRIST a nonprofit?
Yeah, we're a nonprofit.
So one of the things we have here are avatars of the new way to work, which is at nonprofits. Catherine edits GRIST. They just do this kind of journalism. There's not a problem in this kind of story rising to the top of your interest. What do you look for?
In reporting or in science journalism?
Yeah.
I think what's really important for us is we approach climate change from an intersectionality lens. So for us, it's not just a climate story, or it's not just a science story. And in fact, our website is designed very intentionally to convey that. If you go to one of our stories, the topic tags are climate plus, fill in the blank. So climate plus politics, climate plus business, climate plus housing. And we really strive to show through our reporting that climate change is not some abstract threat, but it's something that is impacting people's daily lives. And so we really look at it through that lens.
Do you take work from young writers, new writers?
We do. So we have a newsroom of about 40, and we also have a freelance budget. So we do, yeah.
So that's great news. But let me throw a question out to everyone. We all know that covering science and scientific topics isn't easy, and getting your bosses to publish such stories, especially at general interest publications, isn't easy. But what are the new challenges in this environment that you're facing to get the stories out? And let me put a caveat on that. It's also not easy to cover science in a way that's interesting to the general public. So given all these restraints that's always been there, now we've got something new, which is science being demonized, people being made rendered unemployed, and faux science being out there from the highest levels. What do you do in a situation like that? How do you face it? Does anybody have even a fraction of an answer?
I'll try to go first.
Please.
I think one of the really interesting things, especially kind of in the climate space, is you have some readers at the moment that are very knowledgeable about climate change, that care about climate change, they want to learn more, they're educated about kind of what's happening. And then you have a whole subset of readers that you're trying to reach who are just entering this space. And you have to try for your stories to be useful to both audiences. And that is exceptionally hard because you want your stories to be approachable and to have the basic information and to be able to engage people who, especially at GRIST, where we're trying to convey that this is an issue that impacts everybody in different ways, but does impact everybody. So you're trying to include all of that basic information while also, that readership that is already engaged in this, they're still learning something new. And that is a very delicate dance. And what we've done at GRIST is every single story we do and that we assign, the reporter and the editor have to answer, why the heck does this matter to an everyday person? If they cannot explain that to me, then the story will go back into development, or they'll work on it a little bit more, or we'll wait for the right time to publish that story. But I think it's really, really critical to be able to publish stories that people can see themselves in. And that allows both of those audiences to be tapped. And of course, then there's the very kind of fundamental science journalism tactic of just making sure that you're not jargony and that you're not using, really technical terms. And, Vernon, you were talking, explain this to me like I'm a 6-year-old, like 100%. And in fact, the editors at GRIST, when we hire editors at GRIST, we don't hire editors that have like a deep experience in climate change. We hire generalist editors that can be that sort of barrier and be able to go to our reporters and say, I don't know what this means. You need to break this down.
Any thoughts, Eric?
Yeah. It's an interesting environment because science is under attack in so many ways, and it's one of the first rules of journalism is anybody who's mentioned in a story gets to comment on the story. Anybody who we talk about in a story has a chance to respond, and if they don't respond, it's still incumbent on us to summarize what their views are from the public record. So there's a lot of, particularly with climate change, particularly with everything, there's just a lot of false statements out there. And one thing I find myself thinking about a lot, I only recently learned the term Brandolini's Law. Does anybody know this? In 2013, as an Italian journalist basically formalized the old adage that a lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth can get its shoes on. And so right now I think there's a lot of that is, we have, just to be conservative, nearly 40 years of all world governments getting together every 7 or 8 years and agreeing word by word to a summary document that all of the climate scientists have written out. So like these are the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, and like the summaries of these reports, again, they're like 40 or 50 pages each, and every government and all of the scientists agree word by word in order to publish it. And so, you're up against, on the other hand, so we have, to be conservative, like 50,000 pages of reports that together have been produced by tens of thousands of people and hundreds of thousands of papers. And then you have a cabinet secretary who's saying he doesn't like that, or he likes this other thing, or that just doesn't make any sense to him. And I have 800 words to explain what's going on. And you can do it, and we have done it, and we do it every week. But that's a good thought experiment to put yourself through, is the most obviously documented thing in human history is being described as not true. What do you do?
That makes me think of something that was just occurring to me as you both were talking, is what do you do about people who, and I know some, who they're climate deniers, basically. I mean, and that sounds almost like, attaching this maybe unfair title to them, but they don't believe that climate change is really happening in a dangerous way or a worrisome way. I think, we're all just exaggerating this, and okay, so maybe it's a hot summer, but you've had hot summers before, or whatever, or maybe there's not as much rain as you think there should be, but it's like, so it's not our job to persuade them, necessarily, right? They can believe whatever they want to believe, but I'm wondering about how stories that we write, what do we think about that?
If people are wrong, then we say they're wrong, and we don't quote people saying things that aren't true, or if we have to because they're super important, and it's like, and it's an important quote, we frame it by saying this is untrue, but this is what this person said, and there's it's the mentality of American journalism is very much Democrat versus Republican, but there's also like material reality, and that loses out a lot. So the trick is to stick by your guns and say when somebody's statements or a report or whatever it is doesn't stack up with previously accepted and reviewed material.
Since we're talking about this, let me throw this out to this side of the room. For years there was, in the normal old days, like let's say 10 years ago, it used to be the big debate, do we quote people who are wrong? Do we balance our stories with climate deniers, that guy in Copenhagen who everybody quotes, or people who say smoking won't give you lung cancer, when we know that their role is somewhat to create doubt about the science. Nowadays, it seems to me the doubters have been legitimized. What do you do with that? You're laughing at it.
Well, we're very strict about calling the Trump administration to comment on our articles, most of which say that they're completely wrong, or on the science and on the law and lots of other things they do. I don't think we have an obligation to quote people who are lying or distorting science without indicating that that's what they're doing. And I do think it's our job to persuade people, quite frankly, that climate change is real. And the evidence is so overwhelming that there's really not a debate anymore, a serious debate among serious thinking people about climate change. You could debate the speed of it or various tipping points or whatever, but in our opinion, serious people do not argue anymore that climate change is a fiction.
Nora, did I see you had some thoughts?
Yeah, I think I mean, it's an important question regarding legitimizing certain sources, and I think that's, we're always thinking about that. I think that there are so many news outlets today, and if you deny a certain figure that is maybe popular on TikTok, I don't think that ignoring that they exist is necessarily the path. So I think, Undark, we, I think, take a similar approach to Bloomberg, where we acknowledge a certain viewpoint and say if it's false. But also, I always ask my writers, we want to give every perspective a fair shot, but also, we don't want to artificially both sides an issue either. And so kind of having a sense of what the actual conversation is, and what, is this fringe position like truly fringe? And I think, how I would have answered Claudia's original question regarding challenges we face today, I think so many people are used to really simple sound bites, a lot of clickbait, and I think one of the biggest challenges is how to communicate nuance when nuance is not necessarily something that people are looking for. But I think, we do our best to maintain that, because so much of science is doesn't have a clear answer. A lot of fields, there's more consensus than others, regarding climate research, obviously, but a lot of fields, there's still a lot of question marks, and I think that is something that, maybe the general public is still, I don't want to speak generally, actually, but I don't think that people quite realize just how many question marks there still are.
Well, there's always question marks, but another way of contextualizing that is, are those question marks an impediment to know what we should do? And I just wanted to add that nuance, because many scientists will say, there's a ton of question marks and a lot of really important question marks, but they're not going to change the vector of the conversation.
I think one of the interesting problems right now is you look at everybody here, we are all from national publications, and we're all reporting on this from national publications, and that's really important. But I think one of the biggest things is there is no climate reporting happening in local publications. And this is an issue that has a very kind of long tail in the fact that most local publications have never really prioritized science reporting, let alone environmental reporting, let alone climate reporting. And for huge chunks of America, those are the publications that they trust. It serves their communities, that's where they get their news, and they are not seeing climate coverage in their local publications. And I think one of the things that needs to change is that. I feel like, I guess it's my job to plug Grist, I guess. But that's one of the things we're doing. We have a local news initiative where we embed climate reporters in local newsrooms. So we have climate reporters in WABE in Georgia, Interlochen Public Radio in Michigan, WBEZ in Chicago, Blue Ridge Public Radio in North Carolina. We have somebody in New Orleans, and we're expanding to the Salt Lake Tribune and in Utah, and Flatwater Free Press in Nebraska, places that don't have climate reporting otherwise. And I just think we need to acknowledge that. There's a huge sector of journalism that we're kind of avoiding talking about. And that's where so many people get their news.
It's such an important point that you've just made. Like, I live an hour north of New York City, and we don't have any local publications left. Our local newspapers are gone. So I'd kind of love to know from the audience, like, where you get your news, because I think that's a really big issue. Like, where are people getting their news, and can we meet them where they are? Because a lot of people are not getting news from the publications that are represented here. You know, I mean, would anyone be willing to, like, I'd love to know how many people are getting their news from social media. Nobody's gonna admit it. I get some news from social media. You know, I think it's really important as producers of journalism that we think about the ways that we can reach people. And I'm not on Twitter, and I don't TikTok, but I think that there's lots of opportunities for people coming up in journalism to be thinking about that question.
I think also just to add, to plug Undark, you know, we're a national publication, but we're a nonprofit, and so we have partnered with local publications if we have a story that is, you know, we always try to keep a wide readership in mind, but if there's a story that has a local focus, finding an outlet, and we, because of our nonprofit status, part of our deal is that other publications are free to, they can republish our work for free. So that's how we try to, you know, fill that gap, but it is definitely an important consideration.
Yeah, I know, like, we do the same, and Inside Climate obviously does that too. So I think that's one of the nice things about nonprofit also, is we're just like, take it.
Well, I think maybe this is a good moment to throw some questions out to the floor. Again, let me ask that you identify yourself before you ask a question, and that, Anna, do you have the microphone? Yeah. Anna Matson, who is the teaching associate for the course, will, hello? Okay, great. Will be taking the microphone around and be playing over one for you.
I'm Vanna White tonight.
Please identify yourself. Again, a question, not a political statement, and on the topic, please. The gentleman in front of you seemed to be raising his hand.
Hi everyone, my name is Vishal. I work at Columbia University. I have a 9-year journalism background. My question specifically is, we look at White House using Breitbart News or a lot of right-leaning publications to deny a lot of fact-check, like reporting that's happening in mainstream publications. And another challenge with local publications in US is a lot of them are shutting down because they don't have funding. So is there a way for them to prioritize climate reporting when there are not enough reporters left on ground? And where do you fill the gap besides, like, you know, getting your stories out there for free, asking them to publish it? Yeah.
So for the local news initiative at Grist, half of the reporters are Grist reporters, they're Grist staff. So we pay for those salaries and embed them into those local newsrooms. So it's not a question for those local newsrooms about prioritizing this over something else. We're giving them a resource. And so we haven't had anybody say no to that. The model we're moving towards for this sort of the second phase of the initiative is a co-funded position. We want to see a little bit more buy-in in these reporters, and so our development teams are working together, and we're tapping national funders and local funders. We're trying to make it very clear that local foundations, local major donors should be supporting climate journalism in their communities. So that's how we are supporting. So it's not they're not taking away from another position in order to do that. It's additive.
So some of the students from the class who are in the front row had an assignment to develop a question for this evening. And how's about it?
Hi, my name is Katie. That's it. So obviously I receive a lot of news through social media, so have any of your publications worked towards trying to create journalism for social media or anything like that?
We have a social media manager, and she's been more active on TikTok lately. But one thing that we're encountering is that so many of these social media platforms flag controversial subjects, and so we sometimes can't make video, or they just won't reach many people because the algorithm has flagged certain keywords. And it's not my department, so I don't know those specific keywords, but it's a pretty wide breadth from what I understand. But we are trying to reach more people that way.
Yeah, we also have an engagement editor who's specifically focused on our social media presence. I can't remember how long we've been on there, but we did launch a TikTok. We were on TikTok. And most of that also gets posted to, the short form videos also get posted to Reels. We also do slideshows on Instagram. Almost all of those point back to an article on the site, not all of them, most. Our multimedia team, which does a lot of the videos as well as longer form videos, they also do some work that is specific to just video. And some of that is climate focused. We had a whole, it was the cover, and I can't remember which issue, because the print, the print calendar and the actual calendar are misaligned. But it was on Greenland, and it was the cover of our print magazine. We also did a bunch of videos, including short form and long form around that. And part of that is our effort to recognize that different people and different audiences are going to read different types of media, and so we want to reach all those different audiences in all those different formats. So that's definitely something we are thinking a lot about, especially as we've been through 180 years at SIAM. We want to hopefully do 180 more. So we're thinking about, how do we go just beyond what we have been?
We met last year. Scientific American has a TikTok editor who just makes little TikToks for them. And they're very cute and compelling. And I would think that, a lot of science is just made for TikTok. And yet it hasn't been explored very much, except for you guys having.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of independent creators doing it, and we've actually started to reach out to some of them to work with them. So there are a lot of people doing a lot of interesting things in that media, and yeah, I think that has maybe not been grabbed onto as well from the existing media.
And sometimes you find stories from creators like scientists who just have a TikTok whim or whatever it may be. We're on X, I guess. It still feels weird, and Blue Sky, and so we shoot our articles out through those platforms, and often with gift links. So even if you don't subscribe, you're able to see the articles.
Hi, my name is Sophia. I'm a student at the journalism program in the science concentration. So as my group here, as we start to graduate in the next year and go into the daunting world that might be freelance, as editors, what do you look for in things like freelance pitches?
I think that's gonna, even within publications, that can vary some editor to editor. In general, we look for something that's going to be succinct and that tells us really high up, what is the takeaway readers are coming away from the story with? What is the main idea they're gonna get from this? And in particular, because a big part of Scientific American's mission is to be on the cutting edge of science, what is this different? How does this move the story about whatever this topic is forward? And I think those are kind of the key things that most of us are looking for. There's some editors want a much more developed pitch. Some of us are much more if you want to feel, put out a feeler to see if we're generally interested in this topic, that's fine. But that you kind of have to figure out editor to editor.
Really important tip, make your editors' jobs easier. I was a freelancer like full-time for about 10 years, and always part-time while I was editing on a magazine too. And editors want to work with writers who are kind and easy to work with and professional and really, really care about doing things well. So these are like all the principles that you should bring to your pitches when you start and your interactions with editors. The other thing is like a story is a story. We are storytellers. We're looking for good stories that people will read. And when I approach a story, I don't really even think of it as a science story. I come to a story thinking about who are the characters, what are the scenes, how is this narrative going to flow? And so, whether you're writing for a newspaper and you only have 800 words, or you're writing for a major magazine and you have 8,000 words, you want to be able to tell a story that people are going to read from start to finish. And maybe they'll pick it up, maybe they'll only get a little snippet of it on social media, but some people will go further and read it. But that, going back to the editors, I'll let the other editors answer.
And let me just say, I tell people graduating from school this all the time, do not measure the value of your work in your first year out of college if you're freelancing in dollars and cents, because you're not going to make any money doing it. Okay, measure it in the quality of your work, in the craft that you're developing, in writing and reporting, and in the relationships you're making with editors as you go. And I have a 1-year rule. If you really apply yourself to freelancing for 1 year, like really work hard at it, you will write your way into a job in 1 year. But it may take 1 year, and some people can't make it for 1 year. It's like too long for them. They gotta have a job, and it doesn't really work like that. And so I think it's really important to, if you gotta wait tables or be a barista or whatever, you gotta apply yourself to the craft, and if you do that, you can become a journalist. But it's a very bumpy transition now. When I got out of journalism school, there were thousands of local newspapers, and we all just went and got a job on a newspaper, and off we went, and it was sort of a climb up the ladder, and that whole structure doesn't exist anymore. But there are lots of places like Inside Climate News and Grist and your nonprofit and so on that you can catch on to these days and write your way into a job. I know somebody in this room who's doing that right now, so.
The only thing, I think these are all fantastic tips. I would recommend getting out of New York. Honestly, one of the things that we look for at Grist is this a story where we don't have a writer currently? And is this a story that this person is like rooted in the community or has an expertise around or, whatever. And guess what? You're gonna make the same amount of money for that story if you're based in Wyoming as you are if you're based in New York, so you might as well pay a cheaper rent. So honestly, get out of New York, put yourself in a place where there's not really a lot of other writers producing really great content, and make yourself competitive and just tell really good stories. The other thing I would recommend is what I always look for in a freelancer is somebody that has written several times for a publication. Sometimes you'll have these freelancers that are like, okay, I'm gonna get a byline in the New York Times, and it's fantastic, but if they only have one story in the New York Times, it makes me a little worried that person's not a great person to write for. For me, I'm looking for a place where they're contributing consistently to a publication, because I know that they have their editor has had a good experience and they can deliver and they've become a reliable contributor, and that is worth its weight in gold. So I would just recommend that.
Gentlemen, in the second row.
Thank you. My name is Arturo Archila. I am a physician. I didn't hear any reference to general artificial intelligence, and I wonder why. So my question is that relevant to your activity?
Well, the joke I've been telling about this is, I have to think about how true it is suddenly. Well, let's say it and then you can evaluate. There's like 1 billion things that AI can do that I can't do, but it can't do what I do, but society doesn't care what I do anymore. So there's, I don't know, let's not parse that too much. But it used to be, if you write for Discover magazine, and you freelance for them, they give you a sheet of like their fact-checking policies, and this is a while ago, and there was always a line that said, Wikipedia is only a source of information for stories about Wikipedia. And for the moment, AI-generated material is probably only good for stories that are about AI-generated material. There are some wonky things it can do, like with coding, and there's some utility functions, like it scrubs, it reformats text really quickly, So the things, it's also just like super control F, or so that it'll give you a list of links, but the AI isn't the thing that you're actually helping. It's just helping you find other things. So it's early days and not particularly trustworthy.
Yeah, I was gonna say, probably the most helpful tool we've run across is transcription. It used to take hours to transcribe even, a 30-minute interview, and the programs that will sort of auto-transcribe, they're definitely not perfect. You absolutely have to go over and check, but they can generate the sort of base transcript much, much faster. That is by far the most useful thing I've encountered. A lot of the rest is sort of promises that have not materialized. But sort of looking at the other end, it is, I think, a major threat, in particular to the business model of journalism, online journalism. The sort of first rug that was pulled out from under a lot of journalism was print advertising, with the explosion of the internet. And now, when you Google something, you get all of that AI answer at the top. So no one scrolls down anymore to click on stories to go through to your site, and that is destroying traffic to a lot of outlets, which is a big hit when one of the things you sort of measure as success is the number of page views you get. And so people aren't coming to that because it's being often erroneously condensed at the top of a Google page. That's sort of eating into what we do, and that makes it a lot harder to figure out how do we get to that audience now.
I've noticed, so I actually do work with a lot of freelancers, and there's a ton of fact checking that goes on in our editing process. And I have noticed recently how every time I Google something, I'm looking for a link, or I'm looking for a story that even we've written or someone's written about whatever subject, that AI-powered information comes up in an increasing amount of detail. It seems like to me. And so I don't rely on that. I don't necessarily. I'm checking elsewhere, or I'm going down and I'm actually looking for the actual stories that clearly it's drawing from. But I think it's incredibly powerful. You can't completely trust it. You've got to. It's just a trust but verify sort of a thing. But and it's fast. So I don't know. I'm not necessarily against it. I don't know where it takes us, but I think it's amazing.
Students from the class have questions, and then S. Pang, a distinguished alum, has.
Hi, my name is Sushmita. Thank you so much for being here. So some of us are international students, and we've observed common themes in climate across the world. So what's happening in a community in India or China could be very relevant to a community here in the US. So I'm curious, as prospective writers, how can we bring our international voice to the American audience, and how can we deliver it in a way that's effective and also relevant?
Well, as you say, there's no borders on climate. And so what China is doing vis-a-vis climate is absolutely relevant. It's as relevant as anything the US government is doing to Americans right now. In fact, China is totally cleaning the United States clock on renewables, on EVs, on batteries, on solar panels. So, I think writing about your experience in whatever country you're from is highly relevant, and more so than ever now, particularly if you're from India or China. But I think that's one of the great things about climate is there's one climate, and we all share that climate. And so I think if you can get people interested in climate and understanding climate, they're gonna become voracious consumers of foreign news, because they'll understand that the destruction of the Amazon harms somebody who lives in New Jersey as much as it harms somebody perhaps who lives in Rio or something.
Such an important question, and so I was once an internship, I once ran the internship program at NYU, and I would say for students who are at your phase of your career, like this is a really, really important time to start building relationships and getting out there and doing internships and getting some initial work experience, and then take what you learn back to your home region and work with the people you've met here, but also tell those stories back at home. It's so important that you do that.
So the annual climate negotiations, and there's other kinds of negotiations too, different topics, but those are an annual mixer where every country is in the face of every other country, and every year we go deep, in a lot of it is very active voices are the island nations, the highly vulnerable nations. It's a fascinating and instructive mixer and an opportunity to do a lot of journalism that hopefully strikes at your question.
Esther Pang, a longtime alumni of the class.
Sure. Hi everyone, my name is Esther. Currently I run a nonprofit resourcing youth organizers. So I'm curious about the nonprofit funding model that you've mentioned. You mentioned major funders, local funders. So I'm curious in terms of if you can share what that looks like. And then a follow-up question is, if you have major institutional funders, what type of policies are in place to ensure that independence from perhaps some funders' directives that can happen in that power imbalance? So,
are you saying funders can be like advertisers?
I'll take a first stab at this. We are totally diversified in our funding. So we have, some foundational support, we have major donor support, we have a small donor, or we call membership cluster. We have a very small amount that we get for advertising on our site, and we have an even smaller that we do for sponsored content, but it is very clearly labeled, and we have a very strict editorial policy, and so I am the only person that really interfaces with our funders. The rest of the newsroom doesn't. And so for them, they are focused on producing just the best possible work that they can. And then I work really closely with our development team, our fundraisers, to convey these are our editorial priorities in the year ahead, or in the several years ahead. And we really use our priorities as an organization in order to direct our fundraising. And so there's never like a fit of somebody being like, you need to do this. Like we don't allow that to happen, and we have a very strict firewall up. And we have an editorial policy. And if for some reason, for example, this happens where maybe we're running a story and we quote somebody from Earth Justice or something like that, and maybe they had bought an advertisement on our site, we say at the bottom of the story, Earth Justice is an advertiser at risk, like advertisers have no editorial say in our content. So we try to be super transparent. We have a firewall and we are diversified, because I think one of the things that we've seen when nonprofits are not diversified through all of those is that's when they suddenly, go belly up like overnight, because you saw this with The Counter, for example, the food and ag website that actually we acquired when it went under. There's countless others, unfortunately. And so you just have to make sure you have a really good mix and you have a firewall up. But yeah, what about you guys?
Did I see some more questions from the class? Yes.
Did you want to? No. The same holds for us. We have a diversified national funders. We have regional funders. We have a growing readers. Direct contributions from readers. We don't take advertising. We give funders no say in our coverage, and yeah.
Hi, my name is Chelsea. I'm a first semester student in the Sustainability Management program, and I have a question about the challenge of communicating nuance in climate and science journalism, which Nora mentioned earlier. And so 4 weeks into Professor Dreifus's class, I've already experienced the struggle of balancing reporting an issue with providing a solution, especially if you don't know of a solution. And so I was wondering if you guys have any advice for communicating potential solutions with just reporting issues.
Well, one of the things about being a reporter is you don't necessarily have to have solutions, but one of the great things is that you can find out what's going on and you can educate yourself. That's why journalists are the best educated people in the world, because they're always finding out new things. And I don't think you always have to have a solution, or that I kind of don't hold with the solutions journalism people, even though one of the founders is a former student. I think sometimes it's enough to learn something new and to teach something new. And I think as science journalists, you should think of yourself as educators, really science teachers for the public. And you don't have to always have an answer, but you do have to present what is. And educating yourself, that's a solution.
I was going to say something very similar, which is that I don't see it as my job to provide a solution. I think it's our job to ask experts what the solutions might be and report that. But yeah, that's kind of where I...
Hi, thank you so much for being here tonight. My name is Michelle. I'm also a student in Professor Dreifus's class. My question to you all is, considering you have all read thousands of science pieces and articles throughout your career, can you think of a couple that really stood out to you and moved you, and what it was they did differently from other articles?
I guess I would repeat what I said earlier. It's all about the story. That they took me there. There's one story in particular I'm thinking about in the New Yorker. Burkhard Pilger wrote this story about caving, about cavers. And I often, when I'm sitting down to think about like a great narrative, I sometimes refer back to great articles that I've read previously and think about the characters they found, the scene setting they did. Those are the stories that have stayed with me. And of course also
stories about cool things I've never known about before, nautiluses and, snow-nados and, unusual topics that I've never heard about before, of course.
The one I think first comes to mind is also from the New Yorker, Catherine Schultz. I can't remember if it's called The Big One?
Yeah.
The real big one on the earthquake risks in the Pacific Northwest. And yeah, it's just one where, I've read how many stories about environment, about earthquakes. I've written a bunch and just, started reading that one and kind of blown away. And a lot of it is, it's the narrative, it's the way she used the characters in that piece to bring the reader into the science. It's amazing, and I love a lot of her stuff, but that one is just always for me such a high watermark of science journalism.
It's not of all time, but one that's really stuck out, I think, in the last year. And I'm forgetting if it was in the Texas Tribune or the Texas Observer, but it was after the Texas floods, the July 4th floods. One of the magazine's writers was in the floods. He was spending the holiday weekend at his family's camp along the river, and his story was just this gut-wrenching, going through what it was like, what the house sounded like as it got torn apart, what it was like as he was clinging to a tree, what it was like when he was looking for his niece and his nephew, and I was in tears the entire time. And I think one of the things, it's a very unique story in that how many times is there a journalist that is experiencing the disaster? And the fact that he was able to get it down on paper so quickly, I think there was an editor's note about the decision to publish that piece and how for him it was a bit therapeutic to get it down. But it is a beautifully written, heart-wrenching piece. And what was really interesting is that I look at it as one of the best pieces of climate journalism in the last year, but it never once mentions the word climate change. So.
This is a little off the wall, but one of my favorite pieces from the last few years was in the New York Times Magazine, 2 or 3 years ago, before the US Open in Queens, and it was about the speed of the ball in professional tennis matches and how it's in many ways super reliant not only on the paint of the court, but they put sand in the paint. So depending on the density of sand grains in the paint on the court, it'll determine who has an advantage of the match. And it was just this cryptic science story where this science thing that you never would have guessed even occurred, has this outsized role in the macro world. It was, I love stuff like that.
Can I tell you one?
Science stories that don't look like science.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I have one. This is a story that hasn't been published yet, but it will be in October. Among the sections we do are fine arts museums. And this is it's a large section always. And one of the pieces that I just love is about an exhibition at the Bruce Museum in Connecticut about ants. And it's written by one of our favorite writers, James Barron, who has been with the Times for many, many years and is a lovely writer. And the detail of this, the life of ants and how male ants, the role that they play versus female ants, it's quite amazing. And the intricate life they have underground. And I have spent some time out on the East End often, and of course I see these darn ant hills, and I can't on my sidewalk, I can't stop by them. But I'll never do it again.
A couple more questions here, 1, 2.
Hi everyone, my name is Shen. I'm a current student in the class as well. my question was, I guess a big topic of today has been how to write about science for the general public and how to make them care. And also, in this era of clickbait and engagement fishing, I was wondering, in your own careers, what have you found has gotten the most engagement? Has it ever been anything that you thought was surprising, or is it just generally more what's in, I guess, the culture, like relevant in the culture in the moment?
Renee, you should share about your body farm story. Renee wrote a piece for us years ago, and it still occasionally pops up on our top 5.
It's funny. So I write about forensics a bit, and that story, I mean, people are fascinated by the body farm. I've been there 3 times. It is a very interesting place. I also did a story on junk science being used at National Academy, or National Forensic Academy, which is not associated with the University of Tennessee's body farm. And that story, I think, has probably been the most popular. It had to do with someone who called himself a researcher who was teaching dowsing to police at this forensic academy. He was teaching them how to use basically, coat hangers to look for bodies, and he taught this. Like, I went and I did the program for a week, and went out with them onto the body farm and saw him teaching his students how to do witching, and that story seems to keep coming back around too. So body farm.
I think the secret to great journalism is deep reporting. Go find smart people, interview them in depth, at length. Go find more smart people and interview them in depth, at length, and report. David Halberstam, the great writer, was constantly reporting. And I used to have an editor who would walk around the newsroom, stop by people's desks and say, make one more call. That's how you write great stories. Yeah, he's probably the greatest reporter ever. When he was trying to write about Johnson in the Hill Country in Texas early in his life, he couldn't get his mind around it, so he and his wife moved to the Hill Country for 3 years and lived there.
You had a question in the second row.
Hi, it's great to be here. I'm Yashri. I'm a student at the Climate School. And I appreciate the nuance that you brought to various topics, both sidesism, AI. I had a question about whether you think about readers' potential emotional responses to maybe when you're covering climate science or issues that can be, can induce, fear or anxiety, whether that's something that you think about or, yeah.
Yeah, I had one earlier in the year that if I were more nimble, I could call up. But it was just, I did a story earlier this summer about what is the maximum heat, the maximum temperature any place can get. And it's actually, like, stories can come from just nowhere, right? The story came from just a throwaway dependent clause a scientist had who I was talking to the year before about something totally different. And I don't even remember what we were talking about. He said, because it's never going to be 140 degrees in Dallas. And I was like, wait, why isn't it going to be 140 degrees in Dallas? And so that led to this whole, that phrase led to this whole thing. And the beginning of that story went, and this will be less dramatic than the actual story, but it was, Lytton, British Columbia on like June 26, 2021, broke the Canadian national heat record by 3 degrees Celsius that had been there since the 1930s. And then the next day, they broke it by 5 degrees. And then the next day, they broke it by 3 degrees. And the next day, Lytton burned to the ground. So like that's just a statement of fact. But it's so stark and it's so hair-raising that I did think, well, I think this is the most powerful emotional way into this story.
One of the things that we try to do is if we have a story that we think is gonna really freak people out or it's gonna cause panic or whatever it is, we try to embed a component of service journalism into the piece. And so I think a really great recent example is actually a collaboration between Grist and Inside Climate, which is Chicago has the highest number of lead service line pipes of any city in the country. And our two newsrooms teamed up to look at this. We each have reporters in Chicago. We each had a data reporter on this project. And we created a map that allows Chicago residents to look up their address to see if they have a pipe going into their house. That would have been, that alone is an incredibly powerful piece of investigative journalism. But what do you do when your reader learns they have a lead pipe going into their house? And so within the stories, we created guides about, okay, let's say you found out this information. This is how you request a lead test kit from the city of Chicago. This is how you may be eligible for the city to replace this pipe and pay for it. This is how you look into this. We created TikTok and vertical videos explaining this information. The Inside Climate news reporter Kirthi actually tested her own water on camera to show what it looked like. And so we try whenever possible, and when these types of stories come up, to not only give the readers this really alarming information that they need to know, I think it's also very important to give them a sense of agency in order to get themselves, protect themselves. So that's one of the things that we really are trying to do, and this is a great example of, these two newsrooms really doing this, so yeah.
Hi, my name is Mridu. I'm also from the class. My question is, when I try to pick a topic to write about, I always feel like one of the most important decisions is what you write about. But a lot of times those topics may not be trending necessarily. Or they may not be the hottest topics, for it to be a no-brainer. So are there any mechanisms by which you can engage with your readers to kind of understand what topic to write about?
Sometimes just allow yourself the space to sit back and think about what you're interested in, and what people like you might be interested in, and be in the world, but also start Googling and finding out things, and go down those rabbit holes, and see where it leads you. And if you find something that you can relate to, inevitably your readers will relate to it too.
I think also just not being afraid to talk to people and ask them what is unexpected. If you reach out to experts, asking them, what's something that you and your colleagues are talking about that you haven't seen covered? Because obviously, everyone wants to be on the news cycle, but then that also can result in a lot of stories that more or less say the same thing. I think you also never know, when something will pop in the news. So if you're, you could be working on a story for a month and then suddenly it's trending and you're ahead of everyone else. So, yeah.
Zig while everyone else zags. Don't run with the pack. If you're with the pack, it's not interesting because the pack has it and the pack's already there. Do your own thing. All the best journalists I've ever met in my career were always blazing new trails. They were always by themselves. They were always, ahead of the pack because they weren't afraid to be original.
Can we each provide one bit of advice to students going out in the world wanting to do this? Good, bad, and indifferent, what's one thing that we can advise people to do? It's a terrible environment, and it's worse than it was when any of us started. But what is one bit of wisdom that we can leave people with?
I would be willing to be adventuresome. I mean, like, willing to go places, try things, don't, be worried about going to, whatever part of the world. I mean, I feel like a thing that I worked at 6 newspapers, including the New York Times, which has meant being in a lot of different places. And sometimes you go, I don't know, I've never lived in, let's say California, that's, or some Copenhagen, Denmark. But it's like, be willing to take a chance. That's what I'd say.
I think we all need a lot of help because there's a lot of people running around saying things that don't seem to be true. So whatever the general comments here, or whatever I might have said, a year ago on the panel, we need a lot of help, and we need more voices pointing out when powerful people are saying things that don't seem to be true.
I would say be patient. I think if you were to ask, we heard a little bit about Corey's kind of, entry into the science desk, and I think if you were to ask any of us, we all had very weird, pathways to our current jobs, and I certainly did. And I would just be patient. If this is something you really want to do, know that there's probably going to be, you're probably going to take some jobs that you hate, and before you end up with the job that you love, and just kind of keep going forward. If this is, resilient.
I'll say again, get an internship, write a lot, and build a network. And that's what worked for me. I started out actually in science, not in science journalism, and had a couple internships, started building relationships, ended up working for those magazines later. And how many people on this panel have an internship? One day soon? Yeah, so there's lots of internships available, and even if you're graduating and it wasn't required, it's a really good way to start out in your career to build that network.
I'd say find, depending on your career, you're probably going to have to write about a lot of things, and not all of them may be the things that interest you the most, but find the things that really do interest you that you're passionate about, because that passion comes through a lot in the writing and in the pitching. It also makes the job a lot more fun.
I would say diversify your skill set. I came to my current position, I started as a fact checker, and that was just something I started doing because I needed to pay the bills, and that was, a way, it was easier than pitching stories at the time. And then, I guess 2 pieces of advice. On a craft level, read your work out loud. I think that will make the editor's job easier. And yeah, just have fun as much as you can.
Don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. All first drafts suck. Get your words down on paper, hand it in to somebody you trust, talk it through, work it through. But perfection is a sickness of the mind for writers, and if you're a perfectionist, you will never write anything, and you will never produce any work.
With these kernels of really good advice, I'd like to thank our panelists for making the time to come up down. And we have a small semi-buffet and some refreshments in the back, and we can talk informally for the next, let's say, 10-15 minutes with the speakers, and then the students from the class and the alums, we're going to have a little reunion at B&T. So I thank you all for coming out, and would like to remind you that, again, in connection with the class, we're having Bill McKibben come on November 7th, which is a Friday, and you're all welcome to talk to him about his new book on climate change, and particularly on solar energy. So thank you for coming.